Hey, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the conversation today. We are going to talk about national interest waivers, adjudication trends, and the pathway forward because we've had some intense challenges this year. So we can advance the slide. I'm here with Nate Grow, who is a senior member of our team in Oakland, and I am a managing partner of our Denver office. Both Nate and I specialize in national interest waivers, and this is a niche area. And so we'll be diving into the specifics in terms of what we're seeing USCIS say on their request for evidence and their decisions, and then look at some adjudication trends, and then what we can do, which includes assessing alternatives. As you know, this is a webinar, a sort of a training, and not legal advice, but definitely reach out to us afterwards if you have questions. Can advance the slide. So we have 10 offices globally, and we practice exclusively high volume business immigration. And like I said, national interest waivers are part of that portfolio. And we'll dive into why in a couple minutes. So we can advance the slide. So we'll start with the lens in which we are preparing and processing national interest waivers and how that's changed over the last really 24 months. Then we'll look at the difference between self-petitioner and employer sponsorship because this is actually a, we were really discerning about how we prepare these cases these days because of the results that can be garnered in either case. Then we'll talk about, specific things that employers can do and beneficiaries can do and how you can work with the applicant to improve their eligibility. And then we'll also talk about alternate pathways like other EB2 options and also EB1A, which we're actually having, more success with these days. And then we'll also do a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, definitely put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A, and then at the end we'll go through them and have a live discussion. And, both Nate and I enjoy a more conversational format. So we're going to try and do that today and really just share anecdotes and share our experience as we've been dealing with these drastically emerging conditions in the past 8 to 10 months, so we can advance the slide. So let's start with the framework or the lens in which we're preparing these cases. Back in 2022, at the tail end of COVID, the labor market really loosened. We saw a tight labor market where employers were really just like recruiting, 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 and it was hard to find folks. But at the end of 2022, we saw economic conditions change. We saw employers start to do rolling layoffs, and a lot of those large employers actually couldn't file perm applications, or perm was just taking too long due to economic conditions and the Department of Labor conditions. Um, and then in addition to that, the Department of Labor, delays with prevailing wage determinations was really extending ETA 9089 preparation to 2 years. And then an additional year to get that I-140 approval after filing the ETA 9089. So what happened was that premium processing was introduced, and there was Biden era flexibility. For example, executive orders with recognition of STEM professions and STEM work, science, technology, engineering, and math, and then recognition of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and a whole list of critical and emerging technologies that were by their very existence nationally important and has substantial merit. So we were able to leverage all of these fantastic conditions, and whole corporate programs, employer programs shifted from filing perm to national interest waiver. I actually had a colleague working at a semiconductor company who just put every person for whom she'd been preparing a perm for in the national interest waiver queue and was wildly successful. in filing national interest waivers and getting approvals quickly. And, all of that changed at the end of 2024. Um, for a variety of reasons, which Nate and I will talk about. But primarily due to the surge and just, volume. And then also because the current administration revoked all of those executive orders. The idea of national importance, substantial merit completely changed. And, the type of evidence that we were used to submitting was no longer being accepted. So before we get into the adjudication trends, I wanted to ask Nate, if that aligns with the lens that he, uh, you know, sort of the history that he has experienced, or if he had anything that he wanted to add to that. And just top of before you answered, Nate, I primarily handle corporate employer sponsored petitions, in addition to some entrepreneurial petitions. And Nate handles a little bit different. So Nate, could you talk a little bit about your experience?
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, was definitely seeing the same trend. Everybody was jumping on the NIW bandwagon throughout most of the Biden administration up until the end. And yeah, it's been a huge change. And yeah, the additional context angle where I saw a lot of it, in addition to companies with large green card programs opting for NIWs, I also would do a lot of self-sponsored. So other large companies where they had not jumped on the bandwagon of NIWs, a lot of people were doing them themselves. So I helped a lot of people do those themselves. And then at WR, we work with a lot of universities as well. So I connected with a lot of PhDs, postdocs, early career after a PhD folks who were also self-sponsoring. And the trend was just up and up under Biden. Incredible success. It was like if you just say AI enough times or you just say robotics enough times, it was magic and you'd get an approval. And that's shifted now. So maybe
Right.
we should get into now the data, what we're seeing, how it's shifting.
Yeah, let's get into the nitty gritty. So yeah, filing surged under these fantastic conditions. Five times the number of national interest waivers have been filed compared to 2018. And approvals dropped to 43% in 2024. And so we're just now extremely challenged with these conditions. And in addition to that, the guidance has changed since January 15th, which we'll talk a little bit, so we can advance the slide. Um, and then the first quarter of 2025, which was actually the last quarter of calendar year 2024, we see the approval rating hovering around in the around 56%. And, these numbers are a little wonky. Actually, Nate and I were talking to prepare for this application, for this webinar because, um, you know, these are residual numbers and based on sort of a drastic surge. And, employers and also individuals have essentially stopped filing national interest waivers unless cases meet the criteria, which we'll talk about in a moment, that we're still seeing success with. Um, but yeah, the numbers are a little wonky because we're waiting for them to catch up. But we are seeing RFEs being issued, on the majority of cases, and then we are seeing some negative decisions, some denials as well. So we can advance to the next slide.
Yeah, the tricky thing about the data is that the process is slow to get approvals, even with premium processing, right? Premium processing for NIWs is 45 business day premium processing, 9 weeks. And so the cases that are getting adjudicated now with premium processing went through 45 business days, then an RFE, you get 3 months to respond, and then another 45 business days to adjudicate. So decisions coming in now are, several months old, even some still from last year. Agencies don't turn on a dime when a standard changes, right? It's slow and uneven. We're seeing some officers applying a much higher standard than others. So the data that we're looking at is not really reliable and predictive of what we're going to see going forward. People's practices for how they prep and what they focus on are changing. And until that kind of settles and we get more data from USCIS, it's become very hard to predict success for any one case.
Right, and we even have cases that we filed before January 20th, leveraging the old standard, and then, we're having to respond to requests for evidence using the new guidance and the new standard, and it's really causing some havoc and some misalignment. So, yeah, Nate, can you talk a little bit about the Dhanasar test that we lean on for these cases?
Yeah. So, um, we're still getting a lot of NIW inquiries, and what people are asking is, okay, so it's harder, but how? In what way? So we got to dig into the standard for how to get eligible for a national interest waiver. You need to show number one that you've got an advanced degree or exceptional ability. And then the Dhanasar test of, do you fit the national interest is number one, are you involved in an endeavor that has substantial merit and national importance? Number two, are you well positioned to advance that endeavor? And then number three is a balancing test. Is it in the interest of the United States to waive the labor certification process, the recruitment that comes with the perm process? So let's go to the next slide. So where they have really ratcheted up in this standard is really in this first prong, substantial merit and national importance. As we mentioned before, it was sufficient to just show that you were working in an area where the federal government had a clear interest, where there was laws, regulations, executive orders, etc., focused on U.S. advancement in that area. And that was a broad range of areas. Now, what they really want to see is, number one, a very detailed description of your endeavor. It's not sufficient now to say, I do biomedical research, right? They want to know exactly what are you focused on? Get very down to the nitty-gritty of here's what I'm trying to develop. Um, and then where it has really gotten unfairly strict, in my opinion, is with regards to employment, right? So many of these national interest waivers we did for people who are employees of a company where they are using their expertise to develop a product, to make advancements within the company. And what USCIS insists on now is your endeavor needs to go beyond your employer and its customers, which is silly if you think about it. So much of what people do in the national interest is within the context of their employment, right? People are not typically just for fun, making groundbreaking advancements in their field. Um, in the academia and research in the postdoc world, uh, sure, there are people doing research and publishing it. And so that can still be a great fit for a national interest waiver. But the vast majority of people, sooner or later, they want to develop and whatever they're developing, they want to make a buck off of it. And they're going to do that within the context of a company. So why restrict in this way? Why insist that if you're helping a company, that works against you? It doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that's such a clear way to explain it, and we can dive into that a little bit more on the next slide if we advance the slide. You're absolutely hit the nail on the head, Nate. It almost forecloses an individual who has worked for private employers all of their life. It may have really changed the landscape and have been influential, in their field of endeavor, but because they're so committed and devoted to their employers, have not published outside of that, have not, networked and provided conference presentations, et cetera. And so we're having to get really creative to gather the evidence to show substantial merit in national importance. And what USCIS is drilling down hard on is the economic benefit, which is the classic way to show that is additional jobs. And positive economic benefits, if people are bringing services to a depressed area, really being specific and detailed about what that benefit is and how that is generating sort of stimulus and benefits to that underserved area. And the January 15th um, guidance is quoted in a lot of requests for evidence and RFEs. And the January 15th guidance says evidence should focus on how the endeavor contributes to societal welfare, cultural enrichment, and advancement of a valuable field, regardless of direct employer benefits. So, again, beyond economic benefit, if you can show societal welfare, um, then you should be able to meet the standard. But you must have primary evidence of this. And at the American Immigration Lawyers Association conference last week, we had a panel on this, and my co-panelist was talking about how um, he works with a lot of healthcare workers, and so is able to show societal benefit, based on contributing to the health of the nation. But we're still having problems where we're working with large employers providing a critical service like a utility to underserved areas, and USCIS is still coming back and saying, well, you're only benefiting your customers, which is absurd. Um, so Nate, I mean, how have you been addressing this issue?
Well, how have I been addressing, I think like everybody, feeling it out as I go, looking for new directions, sometimes grasping at straws, pulling my hair out. We're just talking about these RFEs and the points about going beyond your employer and its customers. We have several where, of course, we filed, and we are full on de-emphasizing the work with the employer, emphasizing here's what goes beyond. Every reference letter, the support letter, we know they're focusing on that, so we're focusing on it and saying, yes, this person is a high level, important employee of this company, but forget about that. What they do goes far beyond. They're involved in this other endeavor. They do this, and within what they're developing, we've done this in lots of different areas, quantum computing, all kinds of medical research, robotics. And we say, look, they're going to make this development. It's not just going to help their customers. It's a revolution that's going to change the industry. Well,
Yeah, I
people
think
will sometimes get back in the RFE. Yes, but you're an employee of this company. You're just doing your job. So it's frustrating. Really, we've got a lot of, global mobility managers. Really, it's a different kind of question now that you have to ask internally when making the decision. And it's more of a question of chance, risk management,
yeah.
right? So
Risk management. Mhm.
historically, you could make a green card decision saying, well, he's this person's a good candidate for X, so we're gonna do this. Now the question is more kind of a H-1B lottery question, right? Everybody spends on the H-1B lottery every year knowing that more likely than not, they're not gonna be selected, but you keep trying it because you really wanna get someone to H-1B. So, NIWs now need to be a little bit more like that. There's higher chances than a H-1B lottery success. Or it's more like people were always have been approaching EB-1A, understanding that there's some risks, there's some subjectivity. So it's now, not as much the field for people who want a 100% no risk. There's gonna be
Right.
risk in everyone going forward.
Exactly, and I think that, the risk assessment has always been there, but it was such a low risk pursuit a year ago, 2 years ago, And conditions were so horrible in connection with perm that it made a lot of sense to pursue national interest waivers. Now that the approval and the experience isn't as pleasant, I think that definitely factors into the risk. And we're still pursuing national interest waivers as an option, for somebody who's maxing out, who needs an I-140 approval because they want work authorization for their spouse. Um, so there are factors that weigh in to sort of mitigate or overcome the risk of it. But it at the end of the day, do you want to pursue a perm and a national interest waiver in case you do get that I-140 approved quickly? Because it used to be that there was no premium processing, right? And so there really wasn't a hard incentive to pursue a national interest waiver because oftentimes you'd get the I-140 approved at the same time that your perm I-140 was approved, or really only a matter of like 6 months. Now, the opportunity to get an I-140 approved and to lock in your priority date is much sharper, right? It's a sharper benefit. So we're still doing these assessments, but we're locked into this challenge with the conditions that adjudicators and the lens that the adjudicators are looking at. And to your point about demonstrating, not focusing so much on the employee or the beneficiaries, the technical nature of what they do, but focusing on the impact, looking at those underserved areas, looking at who gets to use this utility or who's benefited from this new drug or from this research, and really focusing on that. I think we got in the habit under the prior administration, because they had this whole list of critical and emerging technologies. We got in the habit of really dialing into the technical aspects of it, and we just have to completely shift away of that into the benefit, um, of these.
That's
So
right, and, when we're talking about substantial merit and national importance, so important to whom, that's administration driven, right? And we definitely know, uh, in lots of areas, what was important and a priority for the Biden administration is not now important and a priority for the Trump administration. So it shifts the category of, who's gonna be a good candidate.
mhm. Yeah, and we're still looking at, the White House proclamations and executive orders and searching those in case they support our case and adding them to our petitions, but it's just a different way of looking at everything, and we know what those differences are. Thank goodness, at least we know that. I think we can move to the next slide and talk a little bit about what is well-positioned mean. What does this mean? And what would you say this means, Nate, in terms of well-positioned?
Right. Yeah. So first prong, you need an endeavor with substantial merit and national importance. You need to be working on something, involved in something that's important. Not only that, though, you need to be well positioned to advance it, right? So, um, it's not enough to just be a cog in the machine following somebody else's orders, working on something nationally important. You need to be well positioned to advance it. What we are finding is all the action is really in the first prong, right? Typically, if you can show you've got an endeavor that has substantial merit and national importance, these other two prongs follow along and you're okay. Strangely, we do get some RFEs and denials where they say your endeavor is not nationally important, but you are well positioned to advance it. You get prong two, but not prong one, which doesn't make a lot of sense, I think. If it's not nationally important, who cares if you're well positioned to advance it? But
Right.
anyway, as I mentioned, all the action really seems to be in prong one.
Right, and these, eligibility criteria sort of follow on under prong 1, and like you said, I mean, well-positioned, it used to be that if you were, working in your field of endeavor and, there was demand for your work, you could show that you were well-positioned, but these days, again, the publicly facing recognition, right? Writing articles, winning awards, showing that there's broader demand beyond just your employer, beyond just your employment. is important to show well positioned. And it also factors into what we just talked about in terms of national importance and substantial merit. And then the balancing test, I mean, this isn't a throwaway, but if the first two prongs are met, really haven't seen this prong not be met. But we're kind of seeing a reversion to the New York State Department of Transportation, the NISDOT case, where we had to show that the level of skill was substantially above sort of the minimally qualified. So you had to show that the person was unique and really like the best. And with the RFEs and the decisions that we've received, it seems like they're hearkening back to that. And even with this new guidance pertaining to broader implications beyond employer benefits, and then the definition of profession, and the documentation of EB2. I mean, for exceptional ability, you can typically also show that somebody should have the labor market test waived. But, if we're filing these for a senior software engineer, um, that works in a team where you have an employer with 30 to 40,000 employees, we really have to show how special that person is apart from their colleagues that are having perms filed. Um,
Right, and, we should just point out, uh, this is dumb, right? This is silly that this is the test, right? The federal government, since forever, has a million different ways that it does incentivize innovation at the corporate level, right? The federal government, think about it, gives, tax breaks, they give federal funding to businesses, there's public-private partnerships. They hand out government contracts to businesses that are innovating. In a million different ways, they incentivize business innovation that is in the national interest. So it would make sense to also continue to give this benefit to the actual people doing the work, who are doing the work in the national interest. Don't make them go through this long, silly perm process. Give them a national interest waiver. And why? There's this huge long queue for EB2. It seems silly. Let's just say it. Somebody proves that I am doing something of substantial uh, value to the country, important in a field that is of value to the country. A lot of times it's in global competition, right? Advancing the U.S., keeping the U.S. at the forefront. The reward for that is great. Now wait 15 years for a green card if you're Indian. It seems
mhm,
silly.
right. Yeah. That's a whole other webinar. but but it's
We're
it
not solving that problem today.
right, and it's important, just to recognize, the framework and the limitations in EB2. But, again, pursuing a national interest waiver, getting the I-140 approved is potentially, you know, 20% of the time that it takes to get labor certification I-140 approved these days. Um, but let's talk a little bit about self-petitioner versus employer sponsorship, because I never thought we can advance the slide. I never thought that I would be so discerning about this balancing, in deciding on which ones to use. And I never thought that I would be in favor of self-petitioners, and even recommending that somebody should self-petition if they're working for a large employer. So, um, let's talk a little bit about why. And I think, just primarily because USCIS is hinging their decisions on um the the limitation that they see of the beneficiary's work only going to benefit customers. If you self-petition, you take the argument and you move it out of that framework, so that you're not necessarily only talking about the current employer. You're talking about the broader endeavor. And so I think looking at self petitions for individuals, and it may be, ultimately the employer's paying for the petition, and supporting the national interest waiver, but using the self-petitioner option and obtaining a variety of letters in creating a narrative where it shows that there's a myriad of benefits, and especially for somebody who potentially has worked at several employers, and or has achievements beyond just the current employer. So we're really being discerning about this option. And Nate, I know that your practice includes self petitioners. So can you talk a little bit about your experience with those cases specifically?
Yes. So questions, by the way, we would get about this going back to Biden too. Does it really make a difference in terms of ultimately getting to a green card? And there's varying advice online. Uh, uh, our opinion is no. You don't need a job offer to get an NIW. When you ultimately get to getting a green card, adjustment of status, or immigrant visa processing, you just need to show you're in the same field of endeavor, regardless of whether you were self-sponsored or employer-sponsored. So if you've moved on to a new employer, as long as you're working in the same field of endeavor, you should still be able to get to a green card. We have found that to be true in the past. We assume it'll be true going forward. And then historically, we'd always get the question, well, are my chances higher self-petition versus employer-sponsored? Our data under Biden showed no. We were essentially getting 100% approval either way. And so what about now? Because they're so focused on life outside of employment, because they're discrediting anything that you do that is within the scope of your job or, to advance the interests of an employer, perhaps self-sponsorship is a little better angle because you're emphasizing this is me myself applying, not an employer uh, that just thinks I'm important for just them. But again, it's a data question. We don't have the best data. It's just something to think about on a case by case basis.
Right. Yeah, I think we can, working on a case by case basis, but generally, I'm seeing self petitioner cases in a different light. I don't think I ever would have suggested that somebody self-petitioned if they had potential employer sponsorship, um, because I thought that there was so much gravity in that employer support, in endorsing the national interest waiver as the sponsor with the offer of employment. But these days I just it's one factor in all of the other factors that we'll talk about in terms of strengthening and increasing the success for eligibility so we can advance to the next slide. And Nate, can you take us through ways that people can increase their eligibility and why?
Sure. So this is the $1 million question, right? We do a lot of these assessments now and we say, yeah, there's a reasonably strong case, but yeah, if you wanted to give yourself a better case, what do you do? So, of course, as we've been saying, you got to put the emphasis on what you do within your endeavor that goes beyond your employer and its customers. So that might mean whatever you're working on, publish something about it. Within the context of employment, of course, that that is a deal breaker a lot of the time, right? You're working on something that is proprietary, so you're not going to publish it. But around the edges of that, if you're working on innovation in the semiconductor field, for example, well, you're not going to disclose anything top secret, anything subject to agreements that you're not allowed to disclose. But there might still be ways to publish articles or present at a conference or something um, about what is public without disclosing any company secrets, anything proprietary. Um, it's also good to get press for your work. If your employer is making a press push around product development anyway, see if you can get your name in there. Um, so something else there within the criteria now they're focused on economic impact, creating jobs, positive economic impact for the country. There are vendors out there that will do an evaluation for you and say that this specific person's work is creating this many jobs, it's creating this amount of GDP, it's got the potential to do XYZ for the economy. That could help. Independent expert letters, always been an important factor, right? You want to show not only that your colleagues, your old professor, your whoever you worked with, your manager, think that you're advancing the field. You want to show that somebody who just knows you based on your reputation, somebody who just knows your work, but who has not collaborated with you directly, you want a letter from them saying that you're advancing your field, that you're doing something important. And then beyond that, you can join industry groups, get on a panel, get on a committee within the professional organization within your field. Show that you're making contributions to the larger field through one of those groups. We find that patents are helpful, not a guarantee. We have people that have developed technologies. They're listed as an inventor on the patent. You can argue that's in the national interest, and it goes beyond an employer because patents don't last forever. It's temporary protected status, and then it's going to become a public good. But we found that that's not enough for everybody. And then finally, it's important to specialize, right? It doesn't work to have an endeavor that's very general that says I'm just good all around in this field that's nationally important. It's better if you can say, I'm particularly good, particularly focused on this tiny little narrow corner. In this narrow corner, I am the thought leader, I'm an innovator, I'm doing something that nobody else is doing. Um, mhm.
Yeah, and I would just say, whereas before, it's not that we were taking a superficial approach to national interest waivers, but we were finding that focusing on Biden era executive orders, and the recognition under that administration in some of these novel fields was sufficient. Um, and so we were really focusing on the technical nature of what people did, and how it was sort of driving their fields. And we weren't being challenged on where does the benefit of the work flow to, and these claims that the benefit of the work only flows to the customer. So we didn't have that issue. So we were finding, just focusing on the nature of the work was sufficient. Now, where we're having pushback from USCIS, alleging that there isn't sort of broader benefit beyond the employer. Um, each of these things and everything that Nate just said serves as primary evidence that the reach of the benefit is beyond the employer, which is key. We need to take the argument, the evidence, and the narrative. We can definitely use the employer and leverage, especially if the employer has federal contracts and is specifically doing work that is listed in a current executive order. But we need to go broader, and this is where we begin, right? We begin with going broader and going beyond the employer. Um, and so, patents will show that because, patents are the work that, other developers, engineers, and scientists utilize to develop from. Economic valuation, publishing articles, getting press, you know, submitting proposals for awards, submitting proposals for conference presentation, showing that the beneficiary, the applicant, has influence, uh, is more important than ever. So, with that,
But then, yeah, the decision here is not in a vacuum. The decision now, and it has always been, well, NIW as compared to what, right? So that with the standard being higher, we got to revisit the alternatives, I think, as well.
exactly, yeah, and so we have to consider the alternatives. We have to, um sort of revert back to, pre-2022 conditions, and we can move to the next slide. And, this is a nice little rubric. Nate, why don't you walk through it?
Sure. A typical assessment that we always do is, if somebody's in the national interest waiver realm of things, well, what else could they qualify for? EB1A and EB1B, if you qualify for those are, of course, better, right? EB1, rest of world, no backlog. Uh, China and India, if those are your countries of chargeability, is a shorter backlog. So, of course, always, if you can get to EB1A or EB1B, that's better for individuals and for companies. It gets you to a green card faster. So historically, we'd say NIW is no risk, essentially no risk. So you do that first to lock in your priority date with your EB2. Worry later about getting to EB1 eligibility or just getting your place in line. But, if national interest waivers are going to continue highly scrutinized, what we're considering with a lot of people is don't do it. If you're going to stretch for something, if you're going to put down a little money taking a risk, you might as well risk EB1 because EB1 will get you there so much faster. EB1A, like NIW, can be self-sponsored. EB1B, of course, is tied to an employer. You need to stick with the employer in order to get your green card through your EB1B. Let's go to the next slide. And with EB1A, if you notice, the criteria are merging with NIW, right? So many NIWs now we're talking about what could you do to improve your eligibility. That last slide, some of those same things are here, right? If you're already working on publications, work on publications towards an EB1A instead. Um, if you are already trying to get membership where you can show I'm making contributions in the field because I've been selected as a member of this industry group, use that towards your EB1A instead. And there's no problem with trying both, one after the other, both at the same time. You can try EB1A and then NIW. You can go the other way around. No issue with multiple green card processes at the same time.
Mhm. Right. And I think, if you're pursuing NIWs, the EB1A should probably, and EB1B should probably be um, something that you seriously consider um, because the standard that USCIS is now applying to NIWs is essentially almost is the same as extraordinary ability because we're needing to leverage public facing primary evidence to demonstrate that the benefit of the work is beyond you know the employer or the customers, and so that all of that type of evidence lends itself to the criteria that you see on your screen. And we can move to EB1B, and I'll just say the next slide. I'll just say that, typically in institutions of higher education or research institutions, um, oh, this is the final merits. I'm getting ahead of myself. Um, we can actually let's move to the next slide, the EB1B. Um, where we have, higher education or research, we're always looking at EB1B cases, and we would always, choose an EB1B over an NIW, unless there are not 3 researchers or, the person doesn't have experience or, a permanent tenured position, maybe they're adjunct or something like that, then we would look at NIWs. But these days, we may be pushing back and saying, the NIW is, we're not having as great of an experience. So, is it possible to give this person a permanent, offer of employment? Can we look at whether or not you truly have 3 researchers? Can we meet the EB1B criteria to pull it out of a national interest waiver? We're just not having the success that we used to. Um, so Nate, I mean, is that your experience too? Because I know that you do some more work in higher education and research
Yeah.
institutions.
EB-1B is great if it works for you, if you can deal with if employer sponsorship is okay, if you're a company that meets the company side requirements, meaning at least 3 researchers and already documented research achievements. EB-1B is great. Um, I just note we got a question. Thank you very much, everybody else. We are gonna run short on time, so if you have any questions, get them into the Q&A or the chat, either one. Question here, I work for a NASA facility and have never had issues with NIWs until now. USCIS said that someone that helps with R&D on important parts of satellites doesn't help beyond the employer. Well, that's ridiculous. Of course, satellites are essential to our economy. They help way beyond the employer. If you're using a cell phone, right? So that's everybody. Yes, it's trying times, and I think that just goes to show you what was a given is no longer given. You have to be comfortable with taking a risk if you're going with NIW.
Right.
Good
I
question.
think self-sponsoring and just taking the argument completely out of the employer-sponsored framework is a good strategy to try. I'm not saying that it's 100% going to be successful, but changing the argument um is a good idea. So I think we actually covered the next slide, so we can skip forward to because we are short on time. Just to recap on adjudication trends, um, or actually, yeah, let's talk about. Sorry, go back. Let's talk about comparing with other EB2 options. Um, and, in my experience, the perm route, large employers are reverting back to perm. We're doing things with perm in terms of the labor market response, really looking at websites that scrape the primary website, meaning that ads will flow to Indeed and Glassdoor and LinkedIn, which are not required forms of recruitment in connection with perm, and still aligning the standard recruitment with the employer's recruitment in order to meet that Department of Justice standard. But there again, there's nothing in the regulations and there's nothing standard about data miners coming in and scraping websites and feeding recruitment, beyond its intended scope and the regulatory scope. So we are going back to perm. We're looking at the how it's formatted. But we're also still considering national interest waivers. We're looking at Schedule A, like Schedule A for science and technology, as well as art, and then sometimes for nurses. Nate, what is your experience with alternate EB2 options?
Yeah, we could do a whole other webinar on perm challenges too. So yeah, historically, we would say, perm is slow, but it's essentially 100%. You do it right, you're not gonna have any issues. So Trump in his prior administration had some crackdowns on large companies and their perm practices, and people worry about the same now. What has been typical recruitment practices for essentially the whole employment-based immigration world. There's no guarantee that they won't get another look and more crackdown under the Trump administration. So when you're making the decision between NIW and perm, realize there's risk to everything. There's no essentially a risk-free alternative right now. You just have to go case by case and balance and figure out what's best for you, your company, and maybe on an individual level, each employee.
Right. Yeah, and I think just to recap um on the state of EB2 and the state of national interest, we can go to the next slide. And let's talk about the pros of EB2 national interest. Um, and I think we talked about already the securing of the priority date, getting an I-140 approved because of the premium processing. Um, and then the national interest waiver doesn't require a job offer, so the I-140 can be used for a later green card, potentially without a new perm being filed. Um, Nate, do you want to dive in and give your perspective on the adjudication trends and then also the pros and the cons?
Yeah. So if you can get NIW eligibility, it still has a lot of benefits over perm, right? Still the same. You get to a priority date much faster. In terms of ultimately getting a green card, if you're Indian or Chinese, getting a priority date, several months faster, maybe even a year faster, can make a big difference on the back end in terms of when you actually get your green card. Um, and then from an employee perspective, the employees certainly prefer NIWs in a world where, uh, the past few years, there's been a lot of layoffs. Nothing is a given. People change jobs. If you're Chinese or Indian, rarely are you getting to a green card based off of your first perm, right? So, getting an NIW and it's just a get it and forget about it option, right? As long as you're going to continue in your same area of national interest, the employees especially really love it. From an employer perspective, there's benefits to that too. Keeping your employees happy. Historically, we were finding that NIWs were cheaper than perms. Especially, I'm in the Bay Area. Bay Area recruitment is so expensive, and a company that's doing a volume of NIWs, they can be cheaper. So the employers love that. Of course, if everyone is getting an RFE and you've got more expense and the evaluations or independent letters you're paying extra for, then they can get more expensive. But if you've got good candidates for NIW, they can be cheaper, which is a big plus.
Right. And again, we don't we don't want to be the bearers of gloom and doom and bad news, but I think that the key takeaway is um that we're being more discerning about which national interest waivers to pursue. And we're changing our arguments. And so, if you work with Nate and I, and or one of our colleagues, and we've provided a list of items and sort of a rubric of what was needed, you may see some changes, and you may see some, encouragement, to put it lightly, on different types of evidence, and especially publicly facing evidence, and potentially economic reports from economists or expert opinions, because we're hitting harder with the evidence that we supply. And I think we can move to the final slide here, the final thoughts and advice. Um, Again, this is in our toolbox. The national interest waiver is in our toolbox. I will say that Dhanasar was an entrepreneur case, a self-petitioner. And so, I mean, I don't want to tell everybody to self-petition, but that classic framework, can be leveraged, and I think still be quite successful, if we align with Dhanasar. And then the January 15th guidance is really important to reference. We have to show that these individuals meet the definition of profession. We have to show an advanced degree or a bachelor's plus 5 or exceptional ability, and then drill down and parse out in great detail and specificity that there are broader implications beyond employer benefit. And Nate, what are your sort of last thoughts to wrap up?
Yeah. So I think people probably the inquiries we're getting about NIWs is do we do them still or not for a company green card policy program? Are we going to do them or no? It's just not a simple answer, right? There are companies that just said, "Oh, we're done, we're out," and there are companies that are just charging ahead. I think every company I've talked to about it, the answer is somewhere in the middle, right? You need to be a little bit more thoughtful. actually look employee by employee. I know that kind of bucks the trend of a large company. You'd like to treat everybody the same and just have one answer for everybody. If that's just what's you got to do to make it go down, then yeah, maybe you need to make a decision. Just we're not doing it. That's understandable. But it's still a tool in the toolbox. It's still going to work better for some people. So my recommendation has been don't abandon it. Or if you are a company that is abandoning it and saying we're just not going to do it, remember that your employees can go do it on their own anyway, right?
Mhm.
Even if you're not going to sponsor it, you're not going to pay for it. You may want to just keep yourself open to, we're not going to pay for it, but if you need your manager to sign a letter on company letterhead, go ahead. And your employees may be asking you, hey, I know you're not going to sponsor, but I need to be able to talk about this thing that I'm doing. And you might need to have a conversation about what is proprietary, what can be shared, and what is not. What are you comfortable sharing with a USCIS officer? Confidentiality is a big concern. Smart employer will be having that conversation with their employees to help them.
So we only have a minute left, but let's go to the Q&A if anybody has any questions. Happy to answer them. And yeah, you can follow up with us. Nate put his email address in the chat, and I'll put mine as well.
All right,
Um,
put yours in there too.
oh, thanks. Yeah. So we're happy to continue on this conversation. And again, this is part of your toolbox, and we want to support you. And I think it's a great point. I mean, if you're not going to be the direct sponsor of a national interest waiver, you may still want to, reference it in your immigration policies on your foreign national landing page as an option for self-petitioning. And with that, we want to thank everybody for joining us today. And um, you know, perhaps in 6 months we'll have a better idea when things balance out again, um, as to really where we've landed and where the Department of Homeland Security has landed with national interest waivers. Thank you so much for joining us today, everybody. And thank you to Nate for providing your expertise and experience.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Frank, who's on here from our marketing department, coordinating with us as well. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.